The gifting. The low rumble of Jasper's purr was the soundtrack to my mornings. It was a constant, a thrumming reassurance that started beside my head on the pillow and followed me into the kitchen, weaving around my ankles as I prepared his food and my own coffee. He was a creature of simple, comforting habits. A sleek black cat with eyes the color of old gold, Jasper was my anchor in the quiet solitude of a life lived mostly within the four walls of my home office. He was, I thought, a perfectly ordinary cat. His greatest ambitions were finding the sunniest spot on the rug and loudly demanding his dinner precisely 17 minutes ahead of schedule. His other habit was less comforting, though no less ordinary for a cat. He brought me gifts. Usually it was a crumpled leaf or a particularly interesting twig, dropped ceremoniously on the welcome mat. Sometimes, in the summer, it was a large, stunned beetle, legs waving feebly. And on rare, unfortunate occasions, it was something more. A mouse or a small shrew. I never liked these offerings. They were a messy, sad testament to the predator that slept so peacefully on my lap every evening. But I understood it. It was his nature. I would sigh, grab the dustpan and a paper towel, and dispose of the small, still body with a quiet apology. This morning was one of those mornings. I opened the back door to let in the cool autumn air, and saw it lying there on the worn mat. A field mouse. It was small and gray, its life completely extinguished. There was no visible sign of a struggle, just a tiny, limp form. Jasper sat beside it, looking up at me with an expression of intense pride, his tail giving a single, satisfied flick. "Oh, Jasper," I murmured, my stomach doing a small, familiar flip. "Not again." He meowed, a short, sharp sound of presentation. "This is for you." I gave him a reluctant pat on the head, went back inside to fetch the dustpan, and returned to perform the unfortunate ritual. I knelt, ready to scoop the little creature up. The morning light, pale and thin, slanted across the doorstep and caught on something inside the mouse's slightly open mouth. I paused. It glittered. Curiosity got the better of my squeamishness. What would glitter inside a mouse's mouth? A bit of foil it had eaten? A piece of a wrapper? I leaned closer, my nose wrinkling at the faint, earthy smell. Using the edge of the dustpan, I gently nudged its jaw. The mouth fell open wider. And I saw them. I did not understand what I was seeing. My brain tried to reject the image, to categorize it as a trick of the light, a strange fungus, anything but what it so plainly was. The mouse did not have the long, yellowed incisors of a rodent. Instead, lining its tiny gums, were teeth. Perfect, white, and unmistakably human teeth. There was a full set. Tiny, impossibly tiny, but anatomically flawless. I could see the squared-off incisors at the front, the small, pointed canines, the ridged molars in the back. They were pearlescent, clean, and looked utterly, horrifyingly wrong in the head of a dead mouse. It was like a doll's teeth had been meticulously set into its jaw. But they were not plastic. They looked organic. They looked real. I stood up so quickly I felt a rush of dizziness. I stared down at the impossible object on my doorstep. Jasper trotted over and rubbed against my leg, purring his deep, engine-like purr. I looked from the cat to the mouse and back again. My heart was hammering a frantic, unsteady rhythm against my ribs. This was not possible. It had to be a joke. A sick, elaborate prank. But who would do this? Who would spend their time crafting such a grotesque little thing and leaving it for my cat to find? It made no sense. My mind raced through the possibilities, each one more absurd than the last. A strange genetic mutation? An unknown disease? I am not a biologist, not a vet, but I knew with a certainty that settled deep in my bones that nature did not do this. Nature did not give field mice the smiles of children. With a shaking hand, I scooped the mouse into the dustpan. I did not want to touch it. I slid it into a plastic grocery bag, tied the handles in a tight knot, and then tied another. I walked it out to the large bin at the curb and dropped it in, the soft thud echoing far too loudly in the quiet morning. I went back inside and washed my hands. I washed them twice, scrubbing until my skin was red and raw. I could still see the image when I closed my eyes, that neat, tidy row of gleaming white enamel. It was a profoundly unnatural sight, a violation of some fundamental law I had never before considered. Jasper watched me from the doorway, his golden eyes unblinking, as if waiting for a thank you I could not bring myself to give. For a week, life returned to a state of fragile normalcy. I tried to push the memory of the mouse to the back of my mind, labeling it a fluke, a one-time anomaly that I would never be able to explain. I told myself it was a prank. Some bored teenager with access to a 3D printer and a twisted sense of humor. That was the most palatable explanation, and I clung to it. Jasper went back to bringing me his usual gifts of leaves and the occasional moth, and with each harmless offering, the knot of anxiety in my chest loosened just a little. I watched him more closely, though. When he would slip out through the cat flap in the evenings, I would find myself standing at the window, staring into the deepening twilight, wondering where he went. His world, which had once seemed so simple, now felt vast and filled with unsettling possibilities. The second gift arrived on a Tuesday. It was raining, a cold, persistent drizzle that slicked the streets and made the world outside my window seem gray and indistinct. I almost missed it. I had let Jasper in, and was drying his damp fur with a towel when he shook free and trotted over to the rug by the fireplace. He dropped something wet and dark onto the cream-colored fibers. It was a bird. A sparrow, by the look of its brown, mottled feathers. Its neck was bent at a severe angle, and one of its wings was splayed out, delicate as a paper fan. A feeling of cold dread washed over me, instant and sickening. I knew, even before I looked, what I was going to find. My hands felt clumsy and slow as I reached for the fireplace tongs, not wanting to touch this one at all. Jasper sat nearby, grooming a wet paw, occasionally glancing up at me. He seemed less proud this time, more businesslike, as if he were merely a courier delivering a message he did not need to understand. I knelt. The bird was soaked, its feathers plastered to its small body. I used the tips of the tongs to gently, so gently, pry open its beak. The beak was a hard, sharp cone of gray keratin. And just behind it, where a bird's simple tongue and glottis should be, was another set of those teeth. This set was different. They were smaller than the mouse's, more like tiny grains of rice, but they followed the same impossible pattern. They lined the bird's beak in a perfect, miniature arc. The incisors, the canines, the molars. They were all there. They gleamed wetly in the dim light of the living room. I felt a wave of nausea. This was not a prank. A prank is a one-time event. This was a pattern. This was a message. I disposed of the sparrow with the same grim ceremony as the mouse, bagging it twice and burying it at the very bottom of the outside bin. But this time, I could not just wash my hands of it. The fragile wall of denial I had built had been shattered. I spent the rest of the afternoon in a state of agitated distraction, unable to focus on my work. My gaze kept drifting to Jasper, who was now curled up asleep on his favorite chair, the picture of innocence. Was he just the finder of these horrors? Or was he somehow involved? The thought was absurd, but the evidence was lying in a landfill 2 blocks away. That evening, I did something I never thought I would do. I locked the cat flap. Jasper was not pleased. He paced in front of the sealed door, letting out low, plaintive meows that slowly escalated into yowls of indignation. The sound grated on my nerves. It was the sound of a prisoner protesting his confinement, and it made me feel like a cruel warden. But the thought of him bringing another one of those things, another small animal with a human smile, was more than I could bear. The next day, I started my research. I felt foolish, typing my queries into the search bar. Mouse with human teeth. Bird with human teeth. The results were a predictable jumble of bad Photoshop, articles about mythological creatures, and forums for people who believed in aliens and conspiracies. Nothing was remotely helpful. There was no scientific literature, no news reports, no documented cases of such a thing. I was completely alone with this. The isolation felt immense, as if I had stumbled into a different reality, one that operated on a set of quietly monstrous rules. I was losing my grip. Perhaps this was a symptom of something else, a hallucination brought on by stress. But the memory felt so real, the weight of the bagged creatures in my hands so definite. After 2 days of Jasper's constant, miserable protests, I relented. I could not keep him locked inside forever. It was his home as much as mine. I opened the flap, and he bolted through it without a backward glance, a black streak disappearing into the overgrown garden of my neighbor's yard. I watched him go with a heavy heart. The third gift was the worst. He did not leave it on the mat. He brought it inside, all the way to my bedroom, and dropped it on the pillow next to my head while I slept. I woke to the smell. It was a coppery, metallic scent. I opened my eyes and saw a rat. It was large and sleek, and it was still warm. Its mouth was open in a rictus of death, revealing a set of teeth that were yellowed and crooked, unmistakably human, and horrifyingly adult-sized. They were too big for its head, stretching the skin of its lips into a grotesque grin. And nestled among them, I saw the glint of a silver filling. The silver filling broke something in me. It was a detail too specific, too personal. Doll's teeth could be manufactured. Strange mutations could, in the desperate corners of the mind, be imagined. But a dental filling implied a history. It implied a dentist, a patient, a life. These were not just teeth, they were someone's teeth. The question of who was the chasm of horror I refused to look into. But the question of where, that, I realized, was something I might be able to answer. I needed a lead, a breadcrumb, anything to pull me out of this spiral of passive terror. The next morning, I purchased a small GPS tracker, the kind people clip to their keys or slip into a child's backpack. It was no bigger than a quarter. That evening, I managed to fasten it to Jasper's collar, hiding it under the little bell that I now found mockingly cheerful. He tolerated it with a flick of his ears, more interested in the prospect of his nightly patrol. I felt a pang of guilt, turning my beloved pet into a subject of surveillance, but my need to understand had grown into a ravenous obsession. It was the only thing that felt more powerful than my fear. I let him out and went to my computer, my heart thudding in a slow, heavy rhythm. I pulled up the tracking website and watched as a small, pulsing blue dot, representing Jasper, moved away from my house. It traveled down the street, darted across the park, and then moved steadily toward the old, neglected part of town. It was a place of crumbling warehouses and forgotten factories, a skeletal remnant of a more prosperous time. For an hour, the dot moved in a zigzag pattern that was typical of a cat on the hunt. Then it stopped. It remained stationary for a long time. I zoomed in on the map, my breath catching in my throat. The dot was hovering directly over the grounds of the abandoned Hawthorne College of Dental Surgery. The place had been closed for decades. It was a hulking brick edifice, infamous among local kids as a place to be dared to enter. The windows were boarded up, and the grounds were a jungle of weeds and creeping vines that seemed to be actively pulling the building back into the earth. It was the perfect setting for a nightmare. And it was, thematically, horribly perfect. I knew I had to go. The thought filled me with a primal sort of dread, but staying home, waiting for the next gruesome delivery, seemed infinitely worse. I waited until well after midnight, when the world was dark and still. I dressed in black, grabbed a powerful flashlight, and drove to the edge of the college grounds, parking my car several streets away. The air around the college was heavy and smelled of damp earth and decay. A rusted iron fence, bowed and broken in several places, was the only barrier. I squeezed through a gap, the cold metal snagging on my jacket. The grounds were even more wild up close. I followed a barely their path, my flashlight beam cutting a nervous swath through the darkness, until I was standing before the main building. It loomed over me, a silent, dark mass against the moonless sky. The front doors were chained shut. I worked my way around the side of the building, my light playing over the grimy, boarded-up windows. I found what I was looking for in the back, a basement window where the plywood had rotted through, leaving a dark, gaping hole. It was a tight squeeze, but I managed to pull myself through, dropping with a soft thud onto a dusty, concrete floor. The air inside was thick and cold, filled with the antiseptic smell of old chemicals. My flashlight beam revealed a vast, cavernous basement. Shelves lined the walls, filled with glass jars containing murky, unidentifiable things. I moved slowly, carefully, my footsteps echoing in the oppressive silence. I found a stairwell and ascended, my hands sticky on the grimy railing. The first floor was a labyrinth of small examination rooms. Ghostly dental chairs sat in the center of each one, their leather cracked and peeling, their metal arms like restraints. Trays of rusted tools lay beside them, picks, drills, and extractors that looked like instruments of torment. The beam of my flashlight caught on glass display cases filled with plaster molds of human teeth, row upon row of disembodied, chalky smiles. I continued deeper into the building, drawn by an instinct I could not explain. I found a larger room, a former laboratory perhaps. And there, I found the source. Or at least part of it. In the center of the room was a large stainless steel table. On the table lay the bodies of several small animals. A rabbit, 2 squirrels, and a crow. They were fresh. But they were all toothless. Their gums were raw and empty. Around the base of the table was a small pile of discarded, bloody animal teeth. Sharp incisors, tiny fangs. This was not where the creatures were being made. This was where they were being unmade. This was the supply chain. Something was harvesting the natural teeth from these animals. And then, I saw another table against the far wall. On it were dozens of small, clear jars. I moved closer, my light shaking in my hand. Each jar was meticulously labeled. Mouse, incisor. Rat, molar. Sparrow, canine analog. But the jars were all empty. This was the workshop. This was where the exchange happened. Then I heard it. A sound from the hallway. A soft, wet, dragging noise. It was not the sound of a cat. It was heavier. Slower. My blood ran cold. I was not alone. I clicked off my flashlight, plunging the room into absolute blackness. My heart felt like it was going to beat its way out of my chest. The dragging sound grew closer, accompanied by a faint, rhythmic clicking. I did not wait to find out what it was. I turned and fled, stumbling blindly back the way I came, my only goal the memory of that broken basement window. I made it out of the college, scrambling through the broken window with a panicked, desperate energy that left my hands and knees scraped raw. I did not stop running until I was back in my car, fumbling with the keys, my whole body trembling. I drove home with the windows up and the doors locked, constantly checking my rearview mirror, half expecting to see some lurching, dragging shape following me. But the streets were empty. When I got home, Jasper was sitting on the front step, waiting for me. He looked up and meowed, a perfectly normal, questioning sound. I stared at him, at the little GPS tracker still on his collar, and I felt a new kind of fear. It was no longer a fear of the unknown, but a fear of the known. My cat, my quiet companion, was visiting a charnel house. He was frequenting a place where small animals were systematically dismantled and rebuilt into monstrosities. Was he a collaborator? A victim? A simple courier, as I had hoped? The lines were blurring, and my affection for him was becoming tangled with a deep, creeping suspicion. The next day, I fortified my house. I nailed the cat flap shut with a piece of plywood. I checked every window lock. I jammed a chair under the handle of the back door. My home was no longer a sanctuary. It was a fortress, and I was walling myself in against the horrors my own pet was inviting to our doorstep. Jasper did not take it well. He paced the length of the house, his tail twitching erratically. His meows were no longer just protests. They had a sharp, demanding edge I had never heard before. He would sit and stare at the sealed cat flap, then turn and look at me, his golden eyes seeming to hold a cold, appraising look. I thought if I could just keep him inside, the gifts would stop. If he could not get out, and nothing could get in, then the cycle would be broken. I could pretend the dental college was just a nightmare, a product of my overactive imagination. For 2 days, my flawed logic held. The house was quiet. Tense but quiet. On the third night, I went to bed with a sense of profound exhaustion. I fell into a heavy, dreamless sleep. I awoke abruptly in the pitch dark, with the distinct feeling that I was not alone. The air in the room was cold. I lay perfectly still, straining my ears, listening for anything other than the frantic beating of my own heart. And then I heard it. A soft thump from the corner of the room. It was the sound of something small and soft landing on the hardwood floor. I did not move. I did not breathe. My eyes were wide open, staring into the oppressive blackness. A minute passed. Then another. Slowly, agonizingly, I reached out my hand to the bedside table and fumbled for my phone. My fingers closed around it. I swiped the screen on and activated the flashlight, pointing the bright, sudden beam toward the corner. Lying on the floor was a small, dead shrew. My blood turned to ice. Every door was locked. Every window was shut. The cat flap was nailed closed. Nothing could have gotten in. I swung the light around the room, my hand shaking violently. The beam landed on Jasper. He was sitting on top of my tall wardrobe, a spot he could only reach by a series of acrobatic leaps. He was looking down at the shrew, and then he looked at me. There was no pride in his expression this time. There was no innocence. There was only a calm, unnerving watchfulness. It hadn't been him. He had been in the room with me all night. He had not brought it in. Something else had. Something else was in my house. Or it had been. A wave of suffocating panic rose in my chest. I scanned every shadow, every corner, expecting to see a pair of eyes, a misshapen form. But there was nothing. Only the dead shrew on the floor, another impossible offering. I scrambled out of bed and backed away, not taking my eyes off Jasper. He remained perched on the wardrobe, a silent black statue. I looked at the shrew, then back at him. How? The question hammered in my head. How? And a new, terrible thought began to form, a piece of logic so dreadful I had refused to even consider it. The gifts were not for me. Not really. The messenger was not the most important part of the equation. I looked at Jasper, truly looked at him, with the clarity of sheer terror. "What are you?" I whispered, the words barely audible. As if in response, he opened his mouth and let out a wide, lazy, familiar yawn. The flashlight beam was still on him. It illuminated the inside of his mouth. I saw his sharp pink tongue, his pointed front fangs. And then I saw the back. Where his sharp, feline carnassial teeth should have been, on the left side of his jaw, were two perfectly flat, perfectly square, white teeth. They were molars. Human molars. He had not been bringing me gifts from some outside monster. He was not a messenger. He was one of them. The horror was not outside, trying to get in. It had been living with me all along, sleeping on my bed, purring in my lap. The exchange at the college was not just for the animals he brought me. It was for him, too. The discovery of Jasper's teeth changed everything. The foundation of my world did not just crack, it dissolved into dust. The cat I had loved and cared for was a vessel for this creeping horror, a hybrid creature of nightmare and domesticity. He was no longer just Jasper. He was a piece of the puzzle, a living, purring example of the unnatural exchange taking place in the derelict dental college. My fortress had been breached from the very beginning, because the enemy was already inside. A strange sort of calm settled over me in the days that followed. It was not peace, but the quiet resignation of the condemned. The fear was still there, a constant, low hum beneath the surface of my thoughts, but the frantic panic was gone. What was the point? I could not get rid of him. To try and remove him from the house felt like an act of certain doom. It would be like swatting at a single wasp when you know the nest is in your walls. It would only provoke the colony. So I did nothing. We coexisted in a state of tense silence. I stopped speaking to him. I would put his food down and walk away, avoiding the steady gaze of his old gold eyes. He, in turn, stopped his affectionate behaviors. No more purring, no more rubbing against my ankles. He simply watched me, a silent, observant presence in my home. He would sit on the arm of my chair while I tried to work, or on the end of my bed while I tried to sleep. His watchfulness was unnerving. It felt ancient and intelligent. He was waiting for something. The gift stopped. No more dead things on the mat or on my pillow. The silence from the outside world was, in its own way, more terrifying than the offerings had been. It felt like the second stage of a plan was now in effect. The introductions were over. I began to feel unwell. A persistent, dull ache settled deep in my jaw, a throb that medication would not touch. I was not sleeping well, my nights filled with anxious, half-waking dreams of rusted dental tools and jars of empty sockets. I grew pale and thin, my reflection in the mirror becoming that of a haunted stranger. My world had shrunk to the size of my house, and my house had become a cage I shared with my warden. One morning, the ache in my jaw was sharper. It was a specific, localized pain on the right side of my mouth. I ran my tongue over my teeth, a nervous habit I had developed. Everything felt normal. But the ache persisted, a sharp, insistent reminder. I stumbled into the bathroom, leaning over the sink and splashing cold water on my face. I looked haggard, defeated. I opened my mouth and leaned closer to the mirror, trying to see the source of the pain. My gums looked a little red, a little swollen, but nothing more. Frustrated, I bared my teeth in a grimace. I stared at the familiar landscape of my own mouth. Incisors, canines, molars. All mine. All as they should be. But wait. My eyes locked on one tooth. The upper right canine. It looked different. I leaned so close my breath fogged the glass. I wiped it away, my heart beginning a slow, heavy drumbeat. The tooth was still there, in its correct place. But its shape was wrong. It seemed longer than its counterpart on the left. The point was more pronounced, sharper. It was less the blunt canine of a human and more feline. I touched it with my fingertip. The edge was like a needle. It was a subtle change, almost imperceptible, the kind of detail you would dismiss if you were not looking for it. But I was looking. I had been conditioned to look for these exact deformities. I stared at my own reflection, at the haunted man with the single, unnervingly sharp tooth, and a final, devastating understanding washed over me. The gifts were never for me. The dead animals were not warnings. They were not threats. They were advertisements. They were demonstrations of a service. And Jasper was not my jailer. He was my sponsor. I slowly backed away from the mirror and walked out into the living room. Jasper was sitting on the windowsill, silhouetted against the gray morning light. He turned his head as I entered, and his golden eyes met mine. There was no menace in them, only a calm, quiet comprehension. He knew. I sank into a chair opposite him, the dull ache in my jaw flaring with a fresh intensity. I looked at my cat, my monstrous, familiar cat, and I finally understood the nature of the transaction. The exchange was not limited to the small creatures of the field and forest. It was an ongoing program. A trade. I had been chosen. My humanity was the price of entry. I raised a trembling hand and touched the tip of my sharp new tooth. Jasper let out a low, guttural purr, a sound I had not heard in weeks. It was a sound of welcome.